Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating mechanisms out there, the mixed economy. Think of the economy like a massive high-performance engine. It's incredibly powerful, but if you just leave it entirely to its own devices, it's pretty prone to overheating or worse, completely stalling out. So today we're looking at how governments step in as the master mechanic. We'll explore how they use the federal budget and taxation to keep our whole economic engine humming along smoothly. Okay, let's run through our roadmap real quick. We've got 5 main stops. 1. Fixing the free market. 2. Inside the federal budget. 3. Surplus, deficit, and balance. 4. The structure of taxation. And 5. Stabilizing the business cycle. We're going to trace how these big-picture stabilization policies actually hit your wallet and your daily life.
Right, on to Section 1, Fixing the Free Market, Why the Engine Needs a Mechanic. To really get why the government gets involved, we first have to look at what happens when they don't.
So here's the deal. A pure free market, it's absolutely brilliant at generating wealth. Unmatched, really. But it definitely struggles with keeping things stable and fair. Left alone, it naturally skews toward income inequality, with wealth pooling right at the top. Plus, it's incredibly vulnerable to wild business cycle swings. We're talking dizzying booms and really painful recessions. And then you have market failures, things like pollution just being ignored or collective goods like roads and national defense not getting funded. That is exactly why we operate in a mixed economy. The government steps in to patch up those inherent flaws.
Which brings us to the big question. With millions of people and businesses just acting independently, doing their own thing, how does a central authority actually grab the steering wheel? How do they leverage enough power to smooth out those crazy economic fluctuations and redistribute wealth?
Well, that takes us to Section 2, Inside the Federal Budget, the Mechanics Toolkit. Put simply, the federal budget is the master blueprint for a government's macroeconomic policy. Honestly, it's not just a giant, boring spreadsheet. It's a massive, powerful statement of intent. It maps out exactly how the government plans to shift resources around, redistribute income, and tackle whatever global economic weather is coming our way over the next financial year. Now, when you break down where the government's money actually comes from, it's kind of eye-opening. Personal income taxes, straight from everyday workers like us, absolutely do the heavy lifting here. That is the biggest chunk of revenue by far, followed closely by company tax. Literally, this is the fuel keeping the entire government engine running. And once that revenue comes in, the government has to pump it back out as expenses. This is them reallocating resources to fund the collective goods we all rely on. For example, looking at the 2026-27 budget, they carved out a staggering $25 billion specifically for public hospitals alone. And that's right alongside massive investments in Social Security, defense, and public infrastructure. Moving to Section 3, Surplus, Deficit, and Balance, Pulling the Levers. Just like our mechanic turning dials to get the fuel mix right, the government tweaks its revenue and spending to drive very specific economic outcomes. There are basically 3 structural positions they can take here. If they take in more than they spend, you've got a surplus, and a surplus is contractionary. It actively pulls money out of the economy to cool down inflation. If revenue equals expenses, well, that's neutral. But if they spend more than they earn, that's a deficit. And deficits are expansionary. They pump extra cash into the economy to try and spark some growth. To put some real numbers to this, the 2026-27 budget forecasts a deficit of $31.5 billion. That is a massive injection of cash. The government is intentionally planning to overspend by more than $31 billion. Why? Because we're looking at severe global uncertainty, a huge oil price shock, and slowing economic growth. By pulling that expansionary lever, they are literally stepping on the gas. A $31.5 billion deficit isn't some accounting mistake. It is a deliberate, calculated move to boost aggregate demand, keep people in jobs, and prop up businesses when the economy threatens to slow down. Okay, Section 4, the structure of taxation, the gears of the economy. We know taxes fuel the budget, but how those taxes are structured determines exactly who is paying for all these massive programs and whether the burden is actually shared fairly. So, Australia uses what's called a progressive tax system. It's a primary tool for redistributing wealth, and the basic idea is pretty straightforward. The more you earn, the higher the percentage of tax you pay on those top earnings. But actually, scratch that. It gets a little misunderstood when people confuse their marginal tax rate with their average tax rate. The mechanics here are super interesting. Your marginal tax rate is just what you pay on the last dollar you earned. So jumping into a higher tax bracket, it only bumps up the tax on that specific top chunk of your income, not your whole salary. No way around it. That's one of the biggest misconceptions out there. Thanks to the tax-free threshold and the lower brackets at the bottom, your average tax rate, the actual percentage of your total income going to the government, is always a smooth curve that sits way below your top marginal rate.
But there is a sneaky little gear in this system called bracket creep. Imagine inflation drives up your wages over time. On paper, hey, you got a raise. But that raise just nudges a chunk of your money into a higher tax bracket. Because of inflation, you can't actually buy any more stuff than you could before, but the government is now taking a higher average percentage of your paycheck. It is essentially a silent tax hike, and they didn't even have to pass a new law to do it.
And this brings up a huge structural debate that modern budgets have to grapple with. When you look at the tax burden, ordinary salary and wage earners often face a different reality than folks who make their money from assets and wealth. Because of various tax concessions on things like capital gains, high-wealth individuals can sometimes end up paying a lower effective average tax rates than everyday workers earning the exact same gross amount. The 2026-27 tax reforms are actually aimed at addressing this exact imbalance between taxing assets versus taxing labor.
Which brings us to Section 5, Stabilizing the Business Cycle, Smoothing the Ride. Let's look at how all these tools finally come together to keep the economy from flying off the rails.
So, our economic mechanic actually has two totally separate toolboxes. What we've been deep diving into today is fiscal policy. That's the government using budgets, taxes, and spending. The other toolbox is monetary policy. That one is managed completely independently by the Reserve Bank, mostly by tweaking interest rates to control the money supply. And you really need both working in harmony so they aren't fighting each other out there in the real world.
The ultimate goal of fiscal policy here is counter-cyclical stabilization. By keeping a close eye on aggregate demand, policymakers try to actively push against the natural business cycle. If the economy is running way too hot and inflation is spiking, they run a budget surplus to hit the brakes. If we're sliding into a recession, they run a deficit to slam on the gas.
And you can see this strategy playing out perfectly in the 2026-27 budget. The government is packed it with discretionary, counter-cyclical moves. Things like a $250 tax offset for over 13 million working Australians, slashing the fuel excise by more than half, and billions in regulatory cuts. These are highly targeted injections meant to numb the pain of a 5% inflation peak and that crazy global oil shock, just to keep household spending from completely cratering.
Actually, Treasurer Jim Chalmers summed it up perfectly in his budget speech. He called it a strategy to shield people from the oil crisis, stabilize the economy, and strengthen the country for the next shock. It perfectly captures modern macroeconomics. They aren't just balancing a national checkbook. They're actively trying to build a shock-absorbing, resilient economic engine.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. We know the free market needs a mechanic. We need to smooth out those wild booms and busts. But every new regulation, every tax dollar collected, and every massive deficit comes with a cost. So when we're trying to balance the scales of a mixed economy, at what point does the mechanic's hand get so heavy that it stops fixing the engine and actually starts slowing it down? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I definitely encourage you to keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.